Hi, my name is Christina Stoyanova, Caltech Y's XCOM president. We would like to welcome you to tonight's Friends webinar featuring Professors Cindy Weinstein and Dr. Bruce Miller. First, you will hear from our immediate past XCOM president, Laura Hu.
Good evening, I'm Laura Hu, a recent Caltech graduate and former president of the Caltech Y student XCOM. I first found out about XCOM through the Y's marketing director, Agnes Tom, whom I met through the Center for Diversity's Women Mentoring Women program. From there on, I got involved in planning programs such as Make a Difference Day and the annual community service and advocacy fair, and gradually stepped into leadership roles. It is my pleasure to introduce one of tonight's speakers, Professor Cindy Weinstein. Cindy wears many hats. She is Caltech's Eli and Edith Broad Professor of English, Vice Provost, and Chief Diversity Officer. I also know Cindy as a fantastic teacher and supportive mentor. Cindy was my English thesis advisor, and I remember many thought-provoking conversations on topics of trauma and temporality. It is such a treat to have Cindy with us here tonight, and we look forward to hearing her speak on the synthesis of literature, science, and storytelling in her new book titled Finding the Right Words, a memoir about Alzheimer's literature and neurology.
Thank you, Laura. I remember those conversations fondly myself when you were putting together your prize-winning senior thesis. I was very proud to be your mentor. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Miller, who is the AW and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professor in Neurology at UCSF. He is also the director of the Memory and Aging Center, as well as the co-director of the Global Brain Health Institute, about which we'll talk more today. Bruce has authored over 1,000 articles, several books. He's written in the New York Times, he's appeared on PBS, and most recently on 60 Minutes. He has been a wonderful teacher and mentor for me, and I am so glad that he took a chance on my writing and was willing to work on this book together. And before I turn things over to Bruce, I just also want to give a special thanks to the Caltech Y, Agnes Tong, Laura Hu, the Alzheimer's Association, GBHI, and Sarah Weinstein. Next slide. Just a very brief introduction to me. I was born in Verona, New Jersey. I've lived in California since 1982. And it's been my honor and delight to be an English professor at Caltech since 1989. I was a GBHI fellow from 2018 to 2019. And on this slide, you'll see some of the covers of my books. I don't judge books by their covers, but it's important to me to have pretty covers for my books. And the image of me and the pipe, which is not a pipe, is a Magritte painting. And I include that because I'm currently working on an essay on Edgar Allan Poe and Renee Magritte. Next slide. Bruce.
Hi, Cindy and all the friends at Caltech. Really honored to be with you today. And what a delight it has been to work with Cindy over the past year and a half, and our dear close editing friends and eyes, Carolyn Prelow and Sarah Weinstein. So I was born in the Midwest. I was brought up in Madison, Wisconsin, in an academic medical family. I became a professor at UCSF in 1998. I'm the director of the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF, and also co-direct the Global Brain Health Institute, which is how I ended up meeting Cindy. So GBHI, as we abbreviate it, represents a donation from a philanthropist, Chuck Feeney, who wants no credit. So you never hear Chuck's name, but he has given over $8 billion of his own wealth to focus on health equity. GBHI is an equity-based program. It's dedicated to protecting the world's aging populations from threats to brain health. We focused primarily on people who are elders. GBHI brings together a mix of disciplines, professional backgrounds, skills, perspectives, and approaches to help develop new science-based solutions. Most important, we work with fellows who come from across the world. We focus quite a bit on South America, and we had two fellows, one from Peru, another from Brazil, who worked with Cindy when they first arrived, and she tutored them brilliantly in English, and now they're writing brilliant papers because of her. Thank you. Next slide.
So here's a timeline. How did we get here? For a very, very long time, I have wanted to write a memoir to honor my father. And it has been quite a journey to get to Bruce and to have this book become a real book. And I want to just talk a little bit about that and the steps that were taken along the way. So I wanted to write a book about my father, who was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's with the logopenic variant, which is a diagnostic gift that Bruce gave me in one of our first conversations. Because when my father in the 1980s was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in his early 50s, everything was Alzheimer's. And as Bruce will explain, and I'm sure in the Q&A, we will have an opportunity to talk about the ways in which research into brain health has become so much more sophisticated since the time that my father had the diagnosis. And what I particularly wanted to think through and feel through was this very difficult conjunction in time when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, becoming an expert in English and close reading, and often reading a book a day, especially when I was studying for my orals, at the same time as my father was losing words and losing language. And it was that basic, awful synchronicity that I wanted to get my head around. And I also didn't want to write a conventional memoir about my story and my family story. And I think this has a lot to do with being at Caltech. Because at Caltech, I quickly realized that not everyone organized their world according to Moby Dick, the Scarlet Letter, and the Sound and the Fury, but rather polymers and cells and neurons. And there was this whole other language that I was getting exposed to and became increasingly interested in learning more about. And so as I wrote some of my monographs and I saw an opening to think about writing this memoir about my father, I always had in mind that I wanted to find a co-author. I wanted to find a scientist. I wanted to find a neurologist. I wanted to find a doctor. And I wanted to find someone who could explain the science in neurology as clearly as I hoped to be able to talk about the ways in which literature, characters, plots informed how I was thinking about my father and his identity. And anyone who spent 5 minutes with me knows that Moby Dick is my go-to text. And that novel has been with me for a very long time. And I talk about that in the book and the ways in which my identification with different characters changed over time. So it took me quite a while to find Bruce. Initially, I met with some people at UCLA, and that didn't quite pan out. And then I spoke with some Caltech faculty who directed me to a neurologist at Santa Barbara. His name is Ken Kosick. He's a friend of Bruce's. And I sent Ken my chapters, and he really liked them and said, I don't have time to write this book with you, but I know someone who might want to, and that's Bruce Miller at UCSF. So in 2017, I was going to be going up to Berkeley for a week to do research. And I just sent an email to Bruce, and he graciously said he would meet me. And we hit it off right away. Our taste in novels was very different, but we decided that didn't really matter very much. And Bruce said to me the magic words, do you want to learn some science? And I said, absolutely. And he said, we have this interdisciplinary program called GBHI, and you should apply for it. And I did, and I got in, and I got to spend a magical year with 14 other people invested in learning more about neurology, photographers, dancers, geriatricians from all over the world. It was a truly amazing experience. We went to classes twice a week. I got to be in medical school for a year. I shadowed doctors. I met with patients. And then I was working on the book. And so I read as many memoirs as I could get my hands on in order to figure out what kind of memoir I liked and what kind of memoir I didn't like. And then I drafted my chapters. Bruce and I met probably a couple times a month to talk about the writing process. Bruce drafted a couple of chapters. And then when we said goodbye to each other, there were some more chapters to be written, and Bruce got those done. So that was wonderful. So that was the GBHI experience for me and how we ended up writing the book together. Next slide. So I started talking a little bit about the goals I had in writing the book, and they changed over time. Initially, as I said, I wanted to write this story about my acquisition of language and novels and literature and my father's loss of reading and writing and speaking. But as I started working on the book, it became clear to me that it was very important to share the story for other reasons. I'm skipping around a little bit, but let me go back to the first point, interdisciplinary crossover. So this is what Caltech does pretty much better than anyone else, I think, is interdisciplinary work. And it was important to me to figure out a way to bring together a discussion of neurology, to bring together a humanities professor and a scientist, and to see how those discourses worked together, how they diverged, how they harmonized. And then the second point was, as I was writing this, the idea of really wanting to reach out to others and tell my story in a way that might be representative and helpful to others. Because when I was initially thinking about the book, I didn't know if the specifics of my father's illness, the fact that it happened 30 years ago, I just didn't know what kind of resonance there would be. But as I started sharing the work with people, it became clear that, in fact, there was a whole lot of resonance. And that gave me a lot of energy to want to write the book in a way that would be as beneficial as possible to readers. And I'll talk a little bit about what that meant. It was important to make the science and the clinician accessible. And I think Bruce will probably talk a little bit more about that. I also wanted to write the book in a way that brought in humor whenever possible. These stories are very sad, and I was mindful that at any moment people would not want to keep turning the pages because it was too sad. So it was important for me to mine my memories for happy moments. And so I worked very hard to do that. And as I said, sharing my story and doing so in a way that was specific and individual, but also gestured toward the representativeness of what I was saying. And then the last part, I didn't know this was a goal, but turned out it was. And that had to do with recovering my own memories. What I mean by that is that the disease was so overwhelming that I forgot who my father was before he got sick. So this disease that takes away memory for the person who has it had this boomerang effect, and I forgot. And initially, I had thought that a chapter on memory would come first, because I think many people hear Alzheimer's and automatically think memory. And it was Bruce who said to me in a draft that the chapters were too episodic and there wasn't enough of an arc to the book. And what I realized was that the arc was remembering my father, my healthy father, and my father in all of his fullness. And so the memory chapter, which initially I thought was going to come first or second, ended up being the last chapter that I wrote. Okay, so Bruce, your turn.
Great. So Cindy, I love that picture of you with your father in the field. It really captures a love that you know, anyone who reads this book will feel. Cindy's father was in many ways different. He was not literate in the way Cindy was, but an incredibly moral and kind man who clearly believed in Cindy. So anyways, this is part of I think the beautiful part of Cindy's writing in the book. Yeah, next slide, please. So I think I've learned from GBHI, and I learned a lot from Cindy, that we scientists don't communicate very well the illnesses that we are, you know, fiercely determined to treat and eventually cure. And, you know, so I think for me, as I got to look at Cindy's writing and the story of her and her father, I began to realize that this was a really compelling story. And it gave me a chance to think a little bit about how to talk about the science behind these changes that happened in Cindy's dad. I was an English major in college. I was thinking I was going to be a high school teacher, and I loved writing, but I really fell in love with science at the end of my degree at Wisconsin, and so I kind of had left writing except for scientific papers for many, many years. And so it gave me a chance to get a brilliant person like Cindy thinking about my writing and helping me convey science to a general audience. I was in Los Angeles at UCLA in the 1980s, around the time Cindy's dad was diagnosed. And I worked with two brilliant people, Frank Benson and Jeff Cummings. And it was a time when there was no science to the evaluation of people with cognitive impairment. And Jeff and Frank brought an unbelievable precision to diagnosis that was a real gift to me. And it was ahead of its time. And so I got to share that story of how Frank and Jeff had shaped the way we think about these cognitive disorders. And I think their approach, it was really the first major step in leading us toward powerful disease-specific therapies. My life is very much research and education based at the bedside. And so I wanted to talk about the experience of a neurologist as he or she thinks about an individual with Alzheimer's or a related disorder, and you know, convey what that is like in the same way that Cindy conveyed the point of view of a literary master when they think about literature. Thank you.
So I've already talked about several of the challenges, and what I will just add to this is it wasn't just the act of remembering, it was the writing of the remembering. You know, to write clearly is, as everyone knows, very hard work. To write in between tears is very hard as well. When I'm writing about Moby Dick or the Scarlet Letter, I'm not crying because I'm sad about remembering something. Whereas in this case, it was brutal. Each chapter was brutal in its own way. So that was a very big challenge. And I've already mentioned the co-authorship and the structure. What I would add is another challenge had to do with getting the book published. And Bruce was on many calls with me with various agents. We went back and forth. Did we want this book to be published by a popular press? Did we want to go with an academic press? We had many rejections along the way. And then, as luck would have it, and this is another huge part of the Caltech story to this book, I was asked to present my sabbatical year to the Board of Trustees, and there was someone in the audience who offered a helping hand and said she would assist, and she had contacts in the publishing world. And before I could even realize that a month or so had passed, the book was accepted, and we ended up going with an academic press. There were presses that didn't want to take a chance on this book because it was too different. It's a kind of dual memoir as opposed to a memoir. And there were many editors who just didn't get it. And we had to keep trying until we found one who did. And we were extremely lucky that Johns Hopkins came along. And it turns out that that's one of the best presses for books about dementia. Johns Hopkins published the 36-Hour Day, which when my father was diagnosed was pretty much the only book available. Okay, next slide.
Cindy, it wasn't that many rejections. It just felt like it. But it was really wonderful when we found a home. So I'm pretty busy. I'd say fiercely busy. And so I really had to set aside time to write. And when Cindy left, it was really a big challenge to think about how I was going to get this memory chapter done. And an interesting aside about this, when I wrote the memory chapter with Cindy, I realized that the paradigms that we use in science to describe how memory works, they're not only complicated, but they're really incomplete. There's a lot of things that we gloss over, and there are huge gaps in our scientific understanding about how memory is laid down and how we remember things, which is so much part of this book. So I would say that was the most interesting and challenging chapter, was realizing that a writer like Cindy was challenging in a good way my understanding of science. I think Cindy wanted me to be a little bit autobiographic as well. And I wrote a little bit about my mother around memory. And the back of the book is a painting that my mother, I think a brilliant artist, did about memory. And for me, that was really glorious to be able to think about my family and my origins as we were doing this. And then for a scientist or a neurologist, you like to know the person that you're writing about. And we didn't have any records about Jerry Weinstein, and only Cindy's memories. And Cindy's was studying at Berkeley for much of her father's illness. so that was another interesting aspect of the writing in this project. But the great things far outweighed the challenges for me.
Next slide. Just to give you a sense of the book, I thought I would just share with you the table of contents and just talk a little bit about the structure. The book begins with diagnosis and, as I said, ends with memory. And in between are chapters that focus on what I learned were called the clinical presentations of the disease. And those presentations were limited for me because I was in California in graduate school and my parents were in Florida. So I saw some things up close. I heard things on the phone, which were really troubling, but I also know that I don't know everything. So these are just some categories of loss that I wanted to focus on, and that I wanted to do what we in literary criticism call close readings of. So clinical presentations such as finding a word. That chapter is basically about me being in the supermarket with my father, and he wants croutons on his salad but can't come up with the word. So I talk about the experience of that. And then Bruce discusses the neurology behind word finding and does a lot more than that. The space chapter focuses on the spatial disorientation that my father experienced. In particular, I spend a lot of time, my father was an avid golfer, and he began to point the golf club in the wrong direction. I didn't see that. I heard about that. I heard about the stigma that went along with that. My father stopped getting invited to play golf, and my mother ran into one of my dad's golf friends and said, "Are you not playing golf anymore? Because Jerry's not been invited." And then the friend explained that my father was no longer invited. There still is a lot of stigma around this disease, but I'm pretty sure that in the 80s, the people that my parents were spending time with thought that there was a kind of contagion to the disease. Plus, as Bruce discusses in that chapter, lack of empathy. And then the chapter on behavior discusses some of the more difficult behaviors that my father experienced later on in the disease. And again, Bruce talks about and speculates on, because we didn't have MRIs, we didn't have PETs, we didn't have any of that stuff. So everything Bruce discusses with respect to the clinical presentations that I describe, all those are speculative on his part. And then the last chapter is the chapter on memory. Next slide. I was trying to think in preparation for this presentation of some of the big things, the big takeaways that I learned during my sabbatical year, and what I thought readers might want to know, what might be beneficial. For me, the most important thing was to give readers information. And some of the things that I found really illuminating are the following. And neurologists, and Bruce, correct me if I'm wrong, don't know how long the prodromal stage lasts, but that's the stage where the disease is lurking, it's cooking. It can be 10 years, it can be 20 years. There's a lot of research currently happening about the prodromal stage. A couple of the symptoms that my father experienced way before he was diagnosed, were hearing difficulties and sleeping difficulties. And UCSF is doing a lot of research on hearing and sleeping with respect to brain health. One of the first seminars I attended was about dementia and frontotemporal dementia, which is Bruce's area of expertise. So I won't talk about that too much, except to say that one of the hallmarks of FTD is very bizarre behavior. And this scientist, who was an expert in biomarkers, was talking about how important it is when a family member has FTD not to take it personally, that it's the disease that's speaking. So if you're in the doctor's office and you, the caregiver, find yourself crying about what's happening in the house, and the person with FTD either doesn't react or starts laughing, it's not that they don't love you. It's not that they've been waiting 20 years to make you feel bad about who you are. It's not about that at all. It's the disease that's speaking. And I found that really liberating, because I think, at least in my family, there's a way in which some of my father's behavior got interpreted as, oh, he's been thinking about this for so many years, and now that he's sick, he can finally say it. And so I just wanted to share that with you, because I think it's helpful from a caregiving point of view. Bruce gave a really interesting grand rounds talk. Those at UCSF are from 8 to 9 in the morning. Everybody shows up and is wide awake and caffeinated. And he was talking about depression and dementia and mood changes and dementia. And one of the things he speculated on that just struck me as very interesting was that depression isn't necessarily an effect of the disease, but it is the disease. It's a sign that the disease is at work, and the changes in mood are clinical presentation, as opposed to the disease being outside in some way, and then the person's depressed about the disease. The other thing I learned was just how bad medication can be. I mean, obviously it is necessary in many cases. My father was completely over-medicated. I think that was a function of the time in which he was diagnosed. Try music. See if you can bring your dog to the assisted living place, if that's a possibility. Try and take a walk. Do what you can before you bring on the full medication. The other thing I learned was that what's good for the body is good for the brain. And I found that very helpful as well. So it's important to stay fit. And, you know, this is kind of cliche. Everyone knows you feel better after a good night's sleep, but sleep and the brain, as I said in the first example, go hand in hand. So whatever is healthy for your body, that's good for your brain. And then the last thing was just the empowering effect of possessing information and language. That for me, learning these words, learning about the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the sulci and the gyrus, it was a new way of thinking about things, and a really kind of liberating way. And so I just wanted to share those things with you. Next slide. Okay. So now we're going to give you a little taste of the book. This is from the first chapter, my section on diagnosis, which is called Hitting the Fan. And then Bruce is going to read a little bit from his response to this section in the chapter. So I just talked about the neurological scientific language that I learned, and that's what I'm talking about in this section. This different approach to thinking about what makes a person gives me another lens through which to explain the time that began during that summer when I was 25 to that summer 13 years later when he died, my father. It brings me closer to him. Exactly why I feel this way is difficult to pin down. The best I can do goes something like this. In getting inside of his brain, I can get outside of mine and get out of the way. I have been in the way for too long. To be honest, this other approach, thinking about what Alzheimer's disease does to the brain, for a moment takes my mind away from what is called the clinical presentation and how sad it made me feel. The science provides a kind of psychic reprieve. For example, I remember back to how my dad would whistle when he couldn't say a word. It would come out twisted. The whistle didn't have the well-defined musical sound and contour that Dad's whistles had in earlier times. This new horse whistle lacked confidence and was often accompanied by a sad shake of the head and a look that asked for help. It acknowledged that he knew the word wasn't coming out right, but offered the pretense that he had mispronounced it and could fix it the second time around. Remembering how the disease presented is still awful, of course, but early onset Alzheimer's disease with the logopenic variant is about my father, specifically about the atrophy in his temporal parietal lobes, which make up part of the incredibly complex circuitry of language production. This diagnosis is not about me watching his symptoms, taking note of their presentations, grieving, feeling bad about not dropping everything, and moving back home to take care of him, understanding he wouldn't have wanted me to do that, and then back to square one. Rather, this diagnosis is about him. But because I had no description of what was happening to him, I could only describe what was happening to me. And at a certain point, the self-description became a hall of mirrors, and I became stuck and needed more. Bruce? You're muted.
Okay, great. Seeing patients and taking their stories is always the highlight of my week. Usually it is the opportunity to validate a family under stress and to collect their observations. During this time, I think about the intricate way that a neurodegenerative disease intersects with a person's expected trajectory and strengthens or weaknesses relationships within a family. Finally, the bedside is where I obtain novel insights into the organization of the brain. While the principles underlying decline from a dementia are precise and predictable, taking histories never gets old for me. Every story that I hear is distinctive and enriching. It is, as was said by the narrator from the television show Naked City, there are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. A newer generation is pushing for more precise diagnosis, using not just the history, but biomarkers as the basis for diagnosis. And this is a good development, certain to have a real and lasting impact on our society. Biomarkers, a term that is used to describe objective tests that can help with diagnosis and staging of disease, should supplement, not replace, histories in our relationship with patients and families. We are a social species. Technology will never fully supplant our need to connect, our need to tell and listen to stories, and to reflect upon the meaning of these stories. That is who we are.
So that's the presentation, and Bruce and I are more than happy to take questions.
Cindy and Bruce, thank you so much for a really great talk and for bringing us some insights, both personal and academic, into Alzheimer's, and for being willing to share your story. Hello, everybody. My name is Athena Castro. I am the Executive Director of the Caltech Y, and I will be moderating the Q&A portion of this program. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the Q&A, and I will read the questions and select the questions. There have been some that have been pre-submitted, so I'll alternate between the pre-submitted questions and the ones that are asked live. So to begin, I think it would be really great to hear some more from Cindy and Bruce. You talked about some of the motivations and your goals for writing this book. And you're very intentional about weaving your personal story with the science behind what you were experiencing. And so when you think about your audience and the readers who are going to be reading this book once it's published, who are you writing for? And how should readers use this book?
I can start with that. That was the $1 million question. You know, who is the audience for this book? And the audience is everyone on this call. And the audience is caregivers, doctors, general readers. The audience is people interested in the medical humanities, which is an interdisciplinary field of inquiry. The goal, I kept thinking what I wish we had had as our family. And having some of this neurological language would have been so beneficial. There were x-rays, but having someone explain, this is what the healthy brain looks like. Here's where I'm seeing deterioration on the x-ray. And not having that be the first moment where you encounter that information, but that you go into the doctor's office with that information. And then I also wanted to share my personal story, things I wish I had done better, to help people with the emotional complexities of the disease. So the book should be used if you're grieving and you think it should be over, because grief doesn't operate like any kind of chronometer or timepiece I've ever seen. And helping people like be patient with that and accept that and understand the ways in which we try and fake ourselves out of our feelings and our grief. I wanted to share my expertise in literature and talk about how reading and occupying the position of characters can weirdly help you in some cases. It can be an escape. It can be a confrontation. It can be a translation of your experience. So the idea is to reach as many readers as possible. For that reason, we included a glossary in the back of the book, so people can look and see what the various neurological terms are. If they don't know a poem that I'm referring to, they can look in the glossary and see that. So that's my initial response to your question. Bruce, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, really nicely said. I mean, I think we really wanted to communicate to a broad audience. One of my teachers, Frank Benson, was, I think, quite brilliant at explaining very complex science in a way that others could understand it. And in some, you know, so being able to write with Cindy, I think expanded my ability to help my patients and the caregivers that look after them. It enriched, you know, my brain in a way that made me, I think, a better doctor. But I hope that we communicated something very complex emotionally, very personal, with what can be a very dense science in a way that I would hope a high school class could read this and understand it and relate to it. So I think that was my major goal as the writing started, is how do you explain this so that it's interesting. It is very interesting. I've been obsessed with this since I got my English degree, but how do you explain it to people in a way that it comes alive to them and they get it and they do better themselves with the people that they love?
Thank you. Here's a question from an attendee. Bruce, could you say more about the biomarkers? Are there a way to test for Alzheimer's? Is it hereditary? So how is Alzheimer's diagnosed?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a not fully touted scientific revolution since the 1980s, when Cindy's dad was diagnosed. This was mostly, I would say, mush. No precision, no separation of one disease from another. Everything was Alzheimer's disease, or everything was vascular. And we have, and the story was, you can't diagnose until the pathologist looks at the brain, and this has been turned on its head. So in the last decade, we have in our field developed precise and powerful biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. It started with more invasive tests like spinal fluid examination that showed the amyloid protein dysregulated and the tau protein. And that improved our precision quite a bit. Then with PET scanning, we can now actually image the proteins that cause Alzheimer's disease. I would argue just about as well as a pathologist does. And then something I would not have predicted, because we in neurology think of the brain as a bit sacred and separated from the rest of the organs, but really great work, mostly done out of Sweden. Henrik Zetterberg has been a real leader in this. Our group has participated, Adam Boxer, but they have shown that the same things that we can measure on a PET scan, we can measure in the blood. So I think the day is coming when, for whether it's a Parkinson-related disorder, Alzheimer's disease, prion disease, which UCSF leader Stan Prusner discovered, I think we'll be able to diagnose these conditions with great precision. Not only that, I think we're moving to understanding as we get older and very old, that sometimes there's a mixture of these diseases together, which I think has impeded treatments, because you're not treating just one thing. But also, I think having these biomarkers is going to make clinical trials and advances in clinical trials. I think this is going to be the decade of therapies. So I think the biomarkers giving us a precision in terms of the molecules added to the clinical story and imaging is moving us into rational therapies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Cindy, when did you first see signs of cognitive decline in your father? And relatedly, is there a genetic link? Is there a familial link to Alzheimer's?
So that's a hard question to answer with 100% certainty, because I was away, very far away from the scene of the crime, as it were. But I did notice change in mood. And I attributed it to the fact that my parents had moved from New Jersey to Florida, and that my father had sold his business. And these are two enormous stressors. And I think my whole family thought that my father was just really weighed down by the difficulty of making those transitions. And so we didn't think about mood as part of a disease, that it was just a reaction to these really huge life changes. So I would just leave it at that. I mean, maybe not. So then, then when I would have conversations with my parents when I was in Berkeley and they were in Florida, my father's answers to my questions became increasingly monosyllabic. My mother really carried the brunt of the discussions, which was not the case always. My father's handwriting got funky. He would type me letters, and there would be a lot of mistakes, spelling mistakes in the letters. I had no idea that what I was looking at was a series of symptoms. None. But retrospectively, of course, now we know.
Thank you. Here's a question around what Cindy referred to as the Freudian mindset, directed to Bruce. When patients say very rude things or bring up some old uncomfortable situation, do these things have truth and reflect some inner thinkings? Cindy hinted to no as an answer, but I want to hear more about this.
Yeah. So I think I'm a little bit well, iconoclastic about this, I guess. I think most of the degenerative diseases start off with their own particular psychiatric profile. And so the frontotemporal dementias, which I've studied since the time I was a fellow in the 1980s, often, present with a change in what we have said in some papers, selfhood. Concepts of who we are, a Jamesian set of self that becomes altered. And I think often the insight into these changes is severely impaired. So when people say things that are rude, they are sometimes true. Lots of my patients with frontotemporal dementia will comment on people's size, appearance, And I think in our society, we have regulated social norms in a way that this is a taboo, and for good reason. It hurts people's feelings. So I would say, rather than a modulated response to seeing something in the environment or a pro-social one. And this, some of our research suggests that this particular disorder knocks down pro-social behavior profoundly in the laboratory, in the real world. So, this is not a good thing that happens with frontotemporal dementia. This is, a disease that attacks our human, our social values. Alzheimer's is very different. And, I think in laboratories in a number of places, our group is very interested in this, Virginia Sturm. We think there's some emotional dysregulation, social isolation, introversion, some neuroticism that reflects very strong physiological changes that Cindy touched on in her dad. And so I think this is a paradigm shift in my mind for thinking about primary psychiatric disorders, because with the neurodegenerative diseases, we understand the circuit associated with the psychological symptoms, the psychological change. And that's the key to all of this, it's change. My teacher, Frank Benson, said, you don't change your personality at age 55. That means there's a change in the brain, and sometimes it's a very ominous and bad change.
Great.
Athena, there's a question that came up that I'd like to answer, because I think it's everyone's, I don't know, it's a big fear shared by families who have people who have dementia, and that is when you're not recognized. Mm-hmm. That happened for me. Actually, no, It's funny. I just changed the memory. My dad didn't recognize my mother. They were visiting me in Berkeley. It's part of the crouton story. We were going through the supermarket, and my dad and I were walking around, and he said to me, "Who's that woman at home? Who's that?" They'd been married about, at that point, like 30 years. That was the first time that I experienced my father not knowing someone. There's a story that was told in my family. My sister was driving. My father was in the passenger seat. My brother was in the back seat. My sister was probably in her 40s, and my father was panicked because my sister was too young to drive. He thought she was 10. I'm sure my father had no idea who I was at a certain point, but I always knew he loved me. And I talk a lot about that in one of the chapters, and Bruce reflects on that as well. So I don't have this moment where, oh my God, he doesn't know who I am. It was so gradual, and it was kind, because the kind of dementia he had was not kind, but his empathy remained and his love remained. And as much as he wasn't the person I knew, he was the person I loved, and I was the person he loved. And so I know that is just such a traumatic moment. And when it happened with my mom, I thought it was really bizarre. I didn't know what it was, but just from my own point of view, there was always a recognition of love. And that's really all I needed.
That's really wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I think that resonates with a lot of people who may be experiencing the same things. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to a question that I think is related to that, what you've just been talking about, Cindy. From James, you have written a book for all of us. It cuts to the heart of what it means to be human, how we define ourselves as human. So the question is, what have you learned about yourself and your journey from writing this?
Thanks for that question. It's interesting, in the editing process, the press was wonderful, but there was one editor who was a bit more heavy-handed than I wanted, and really wanted the story to be one from I was lost and now I'm found kind of thing. Things were terrible and now they're all better. And so, just speaking just for me, like, the grief just never fully ends. It's always there. And I have an image in one of the chapters where I talk about myself as being a flat tire, and now it's patched. I'm patched. That's the best that it gets. You don't get to be a new tire. So I learned that. And I like analogies a lot. I use a lot of them in the book. And I learned that, what else did I learn? That telling this story to other people, one that I kept inside for a really long time. Someone asked if I had gone to support groups. No, it didn't even occur to me. The doctors didn't recommend it. You just were really on your own. And so I learned that you can't do things alone. That's the big thing I learned. I learned that I needed to write this book with someone else. So that was huge. I kind of knew it going in, but I really knew it coming out. And so that was incredibly valuable. I hope that answers the question.
How about you, Bruce? What did you learn from this process?
Yeah, there were some of the chapters that just insights about things just rolled over me, generated by Cindy's writing. And the crouton story, which I wrote quite a bit about, what is a crouton? How do we learn to conceptualize a crouton and name it? This was forced me to think about how I learned concepts of the world through a grandfather who read with me. I was fanatical reader, and it made me realize how much a good education enriches who we are. Our internal architecture is just greatly built with these stories. And in my case, it was stories about Tom Brown's school days in England and morals and values. And so I think that was writing that chapter with Cindy was really fun for me. It was the first one we did. And then the last one, memory. And like Cindy said, it was like, it just challenged all of my scientific beliefs. It really gave me new ideas about how we should study memory. And then it brought memories up that I had never digested. One about my father, who was a brilliant person who advised me throughout my life, and he developed a brain tumor and couldn't. And it was the loss of his dignity, and an event that happened that, where I wheeled him in public and observed 15 years ago something that really changed the way I think about, in a more empathic way, what happens to our patients. And all of a sudden, this man who was dynamic, he would walk into a shop and everyone would look at him, and he would bring out the best in people. All of a sudden, people were looking at me. They ignored my father. And, it was very painful watching it then, but I never remembered it. So writing about memory, that was something I think that really changed the way I think about the loss of dignity with these diseases. And it's not because people with these diseases are much less. And often, they're quite extraordinary. They're putting up Olympic efforts to communicate, to, love, as Cindy talked about. So this is something that I really changed me. And I still, in a painful way, I think sometimes pain changes our brains in a good way, but in a painful way, that was a very painful memory.
Thank you for sharing, both of you. I realize that it's a little bit after 6, but for those of you in the audience who are willing to hang with us and stay with us a little longer, Bruce and Cindy have agreed to stay also and answer as many questions as we can. So I think we do have time for a couple more questions. And what I'm going to do is drop the website for the book, the link, in the chat so that you can check it out. You can also find out how to reach Cindy and Bruce as well, if you would like to. So here's a very practical question that I think a lot of people struggle with. This is about losing words, what to do as a relative. Should I fill in? Sometimes I have no clue what my father wants to talk about, so I cannot help, but I do not want him to just be stuck. What to do?
I think, this is why I love clinics so much, is because I think for each person, there's a slightly individualized answer. And almost never does one size fit all. I think, does it help the person to have to struggle through this? Is anything positive gained by letting them, become embarrassed and struggle to find a word? I don't think so. But I think, for some people, there may be a very personal reason that they want, to find the word themselves. And then when we step in, it's a degradation. So I would say in general, I think it's fine to fill in and, keep your loved one comfortable and communicating. And in this way, you're being a loving, helping relative. It's not changing the brain in any good way to make this person struggle to find the word. On the other hand, we've learned, and one of the leaders in this is Marcel Mesalem for Northwestern and Mario Gorno Tempini at our site, is you can rehabilitate language to some extent in people with Alzheimer's disease and progressive language disorder. So I think formal therapy for word finding, much to my surprise, I didn't think it would work. It works. And I think in general, we've underestimated the capability of the people that we see with these disorders and the malleability of their brain, even though a degenerative disease has set in.
I would add to that that sometimes just holding the person and saying it's okay, you don't know the word, that the physical touch can really bring down the level of anxiety. And that's something I wish I had thought of. I wish I had done that with my father. Again, as Bruce said, every situation is individual, but I would definitely have that in my arsenal of strategies. The other thing, this isn't really about words and the specific question, but there's been just so much research about the value of music and and Bruce can talk much more about this, but the capacity of the brain to remember music, even when words are gone, they can do the words of the music. And so there are different kinds of redirection techniques that I think caregivers can learn and benefit from and reduce their own anxiety at the same time as you're working to reduce the stress on the person who's struggling.
Yeah, our NIH director, Francis Collins, is a pretty darn good guitar player, fiddler. And he and Renee Fleming are leading an effort to think about the role of music in the brain, how to enhance what is there. And I think it's a really exciting space.
Great. So we have one last question, I think, or time for one last question. There's been a lot of publicity and press about this new drug that's been approved by the FDA. Can you talk a little bit about that? And Cindy, maybe talk about your experience with medication with your father.
So it's an interesting story, and we've had a decade with efforts to clear the amyloid protein out of the brain, and it looked kind of desperate a couple of years ago, and most of the trials had been negative. The company that developed this antibody aducanumab actually stopped a study due to futility. Then they rethought it and brought data to the FDA. I think what the antibody does, and it's clear, and I think this is the reason it was approved, is that it clears amyloid out of the brain. I mean, unequivocally so. So the clinical data in terms of helping people stabilize is soft. The data on the ability to clear amyloid is hard. I'm a Taoist, so I sort of believe that this may be like the beginnings of chemotherapy. When I was in medical school, people were just beginning to make dents into cancer with dual, triple, quadruple therapies. And I think clearing amyloid, what I believe is it hasn't been enough. And I think most of the people in our field agree with this. Maybe if we got in when the first amyloid proteins started to deposit in the brain, maybe we might have a cure, but most of us don't think that'll be enough. So I think it's a new era though. I think it shows that when we direct our minds to something in science, not as magnificently as the COVID story, but we can do what we're trying to do. And then, interpreting the data honestly is really the next step. And, I think there's a lot of controversy in our field whether this drug should have been approved or not. But it is approved. And I think we're going to learn a lot from this. It's going to change our world, those of us looking after people with these disorders. And I hope something good comes from it. That I would say for sure. And then, I never answer these questions, but I'm going to ask myself this and answer it. If I had very, very mild Alzheimer's disease, not advanced Alzheimer's, very, very mild, and I had a chance to take this anti-amyloid antibody, would I take it? I guess I would. It's hope. And I think this is really important for patients, caregivers, doctors, is this intersection. And having hope is so incredibly powerful and important.
Yeah, I talk about medicine quite a bit in the chapter on behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, when my father was diagnosed and when he was in various nursing homes, I think that the use of some of these medications was really rampant. And I have a whole Jeremiad about the word agitated, because agitation is what gets the pharmacological ball rolling. And so I believe that we should not be using the word agitated. And that was code for, at least with my father, turning him into a zombie because he was agitated. And that was basically what the medicine did. And now we know that there are many other options to try before you use these really heavy duty medicines. And I learned about a lot of them in the GBHI group. We had people who were working on the benefits of dementia and dance. We had someone who was interested in geriatric architecture. What can you do in your home to make the space more dementia friendly? Everything from lighting to what the doors are like, what the mirrors are like, having someone come into the space and make it better for the person who is having these various experiences. So the good news, I think, is that there are many more strategies for dealing with some of these effects of the disease. That said, I understand that the staff in nursing homes, the staff members are really not paid enough for what they do, and they need to sleep. And so a lot of sleep medication needs to get distributed. So I understand the pros and cons, but there's medicine, and then there's turning the person into big pharma, which is unfortunately what happened with my father, and I think probably wasn't that uncommon during that time. But that's a terrible way to end. I wish there was another question that maybe I can pull up that is a little happier way to conclude this. I'm just sort of sorting through these.
Well, maybe we can end with, we talked a little bit about the stigma.
Yeah.
Is prevalent here with some of the behavior that sort of manifests as a result of the disease. And so what do you think we need to do to get to this level of acceptance?
Yeah, you go ahead, Cindy. Yeah.
You know, that is such a hard question. Obviously talking about it is really important, and people sharing their stories. I don't know. I don't know.
I was going to say the same thing, Cindy. I mean, I think honesty. I think when I started in this space, you know, families almost forbid you from, you know, saying the word Alzheimer's. And in my lifetime in this space, I don't think I've ever hurt a person by saying the word Alzheimer. You know, and I think, you know, this was the great play by Tennessee Williams, help me here, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And the theme there is Big Daddy is, you know, being denied the right to know he has cancer. And that's where our society was in the 50s and 60s. And I think we're hurdling this, but every poem written about it, every movie, every play, every song, you know, education of medical students, social workers. I think this process of helping people understand it and also emphasizing, you know, the strengths of the people that we work with, that this is not a monolith that turns people into zombies. Some of these people become much more human, and they bring out our humanity as well. So I think glorifying in the right way what caregivers give back every day, you know, telling the story, that's the artists of GBHI. But you know, I love honesty. I think it's almost always the right answer here.
Thank you. Now we've gone way over time, but thank you so much for this talk. Thank you for being willing to tell your story and to share so that others can learn from them. And I know I've gotten some takeaways myself, and I'm looking forward to reading this book. And we have just a few more minutes of the program. I'm going to turn it over to Cindy Bankston now, who is a Caltech Y board member, for our book giveaway, which Cindy has so graciously agreed to personalize for our winners. So Cindy.
Oh, Cindy, you're muted.
Still muted. Hi, I'm Cindy Bankson, and I am a new member of the Caltech Board of Directors. Real quickly, the Y is a remarkable, independent, student-driven nonprofit that enriches the lives of many Caltech students, and through their community service, their civic engagement, and their scientific leadership, they improve not just our local community, but eventually our country and the world. For those of you that want to get deeper into tonight's content, tonight might be your lucky day, because we are going to give away 3 of Cindy and Bruce's books. And all of your names have been entered into our drawing. And Agnes Tong, our development and marketing director, is going to spin the wheel. And we're going to find out who wins the first of 3 books. Agnes? Okay, congratulations. We're going to do 2 more winners, and in September, when the books are available, we'll be in touch with you and make plans to deliver the book to you. So let's go for winner number 2. Oh my. Susan Clayton, congratulations. And for our final third winner, Elizabeth, congratulations. Oh, okay. We just wanted to do something fun so that we could share this important content with you. And remember, if you were not one of our lucky winners, the book will be available in the fall online and through Vroman's. So please don't forget that. And perhaps some of your family or your friends would really benefit from it. As I mentioned to Sydney at the beginning, 12 years ago at age 58, my own brother-in-law was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and 2 months ago he passed away. And even what I've learned tonight, much less the book, would have been so helpful if we had known that over the last decade. So thanks to Bruce and Cindy for writing this really important book. Also in the fall, the Caltech Y will be having our next exclusive members only presentation. As COVID wanes, we're going to go back to members only events. And if you'd like to keep in touch and know exactly what's going on, please join Friends of the Caltech Y. You can go to our website at caltechy.org and enroll there for $200 a month. It's an important way to support everything that the Caltech Y does. So thank you very much. And now, another board member, Sandia, who brought us the speaker today, is going to close out our evening with some closing remarks.
Thanks. Our thanks on behalf of the Caltech board and everybody else here today to Cindy and Bruce. We loved the talk. Thank you so much for coming and sharing everything with us. We look forward to reading the books. Goodbye.